Welcome back to Homeschoolers of Maine's video series, Your Voice Matters, featuring many voices from around the country and the state, all speaking to us about the importance of protecting freedom. I'm Angela Hurd. Before I introduce our next voice, I'd like to remind you to check out the Protecting Freedom page, where you'll find an interactive unit study called Family and Freedom. You'll find an in-depth literature study exploring the dangers of totalitarianism, and that's available for free until Patriots Day. And you'll also find print resources and news and video resources as well. And also keep sending in your homeschoolers' work about protecting freedom through their music, art, writing, poetry, and other pieces. Also keep sending in stories about the veterans in your family, stories written and video. And you can do that through the Student Voices section on the Protecting Freedom page. Our next voice is Leo Martin. He is an educator and an author and an expert historian in the early history of our nation. He is the education director at the Jenny Museum in Plymouth, Massachusetts, where he lectures and gives tours in full pilgrim costume. He and his wife Nancy work together at the museum, preserving the truth about the Christian heritage of our country. In this passionate piece, Leo takes us back to Plymouth, America's hometown, and back to the roots of our unique civil government. He stresses the importance of protecting property rights and protecting economic freedom. And he also stresses that we must pass on the truth of history and biblical law to the next generation. May you be inspired by this powerful piece.
Welcome to Plymouth, America's hometown. Established in 1620 by the Pilgrims when they came here from England to start a new life based on biblical law. But to tell the story, we need to really know what the Pilgrims were all about. Back in the 1600s, the Pilgrims had a little problem with a gentleman back in England by the name of King James. What's the problem they had with him? He was the King of England and the head of the Anglican Church. When King James set the law in England, he set the law for everybody. Everybody in England sat under the same rule of law, except King James. He was above the law. He didn't have to follow his own law. Not only that, if you belonged to his church, the Anglican Church, and you wanted to pray, knock your lights out, pray all day long. As long as the subject of your prayer was King James, he thought he was God. Divine right of kings. Kind of rubbed our pastor the wrong way. John Robinson, the pastor of the Pilgrims, took his folks out of the Anglican Church, and they had church in their homes. In other words, the Pilgrims separated from the Church of England. That's why we're called separatists. Another group back then, theologically similar to the Pilgrims, stayed in the Anglican Church and tried to purify it from within. We call them the Puritans. They came 10 years later and founded Boston. But folks, this is a very big difference. Because when John Robinson did that, separated from the church, he never wanted to see one person in charge of everything ever again like the king. So he had his congregation elect him pastor, not appoint him. Appoint him, you can't get rid of him. Elect him, you can dump him. But you know what that did for us? That started self-rule in our country. The result, the Mayflower Compact, the first document to self-rule, where we elected John Carver, the first freely elected official in the United States. Of course, the question is this. Where in the world did John Robinson come up with this self-rule thing in the first place? Back then, there was no self-rule. Everything was tyrannical. He came up with it when he started reading the Bible. And in the Old Testament, he came across a little passage called the Dominion Charter. We're to take dominion over the earth, over the animals, birds, fish, things that creep and crawl. But he also read this, not each other. You see, Robinson read, we're all made in the image of God. Well, if we're all made in the image of God, then no human being has a right to be above another human being without their consent. Self-rule, civil government is a biblical principle. You cannot have civil government without biblical law. And the way I like to explain it to people is this. Want me to be king? Happy to do it. I'll take the job. And you know what I'm going to do today? I'm going to set the law. You know what I'm going to do next week? Change it in my favor. But I can't change God's law. Without that truth, without that constant, you cannot have a civil government. So what is the story with these people? Let's back up a little bit. Back in the 1600s, where they had that little problem with King James, and King James thinking he was God and all, they separated from the Church of England and started church in their homes. And they started a church in a town called Scrooby, England. And when they did that, they wrote a covenant called the Scrooby Covenant, where they would honor and love one another under God as king. Now, here's the thing. You could belong to their church if you wanted to, but you didn't have to. See, you had to belong to King James's church. If you didn't in England, you would be persecuted. But you didn't have to belong to the church in Scrooby, the Covenant Church. But if you're going to belong, follow the rules. And the rules were biblical law. We were a biblical congregation under God with biblical law, and we elected our officials. So what this does initially is take the power out of the hands of the leader or the king and puts it into the hands of the people. Because if you don't like what's going on, you can unelect those people. So the Scrooby Covenant was the first document like that, and what happened then, because they separated from the church, they were persecuted, and they were forced out of England and went to Holland for 12 years where they could worship freely. Well, while in Holland, the congregation grew to over 300 people. When they came here 12 years later, their pastor, Pastor Robinson, had to stay back with the majority of the congregation, and a gentleman called William Brewster, the elder of the church, came in his place and did all the preaching. But he was not a preacher by trade, he was a printer. And while he was in England, he printed materials against the Anglican Church. That did not sit well with the king. Brewster had to jump on the Mayflower and get out of town. Had he been caught, he would have been imprisoned. Unfortunately, his partner, Thomas Brewer, did not make it. Spent the next 14 years in prison, where he died. But the Pilgrims did make it. In their first project in Plymouth, they built a common house, a building they would share. That's where they would hold town meeting and church. But as you can imagine, when they arrived, there was nowhere to stay. They stayed in the common house for the first winter. Well, that common house had a thatched roof, caught a spark, and it burned. All the Pilgrims got out on time, nobody died, but they did rebuild the common house, finish it in the spring. And that is where in 1621 they signed a peace treaty with the Indians. That lasted 55 years, the longest lasting peace treaty with the Indians in our country's history. We're all equal in the sight of God. That means the Indians. And so we treated the Pilgrims, the Indians, just as equally as we treated each other. And we signed that peace treaty and had a close relationship with them for 55 years. All under biblical law. Where do you come up with something like this? You come up with something like this when you exercise the most important commandment: love God, love your neighbor, and love yourself. See, because if we don't love, we'll take advantage of people. I'll give you an example. When the Pilgrims originally came to Plymouth, their economic situation was communal. That, of course, means that everybody at the plantation worked in the same field and grew their food. Then at the end of the season, they simply evenly split with each other what they produced. Sounds fair enough? Oh, and of course, it didn't work. And I'll tell you why. If you and I both went out in the field to work, you worked hard and I did not, I would still be paid what you were paid. There was no reward for hard work. 102 came on the Mayflower, 51 died the first winter. The first 3 years, they all almost starved. Why? They didn't produce. There was no incentive. But from 1623 on, they never had a problem. What changed? The way they did business. 1623, the governor changed to land ownership. Now every family owned their own land, grew their own food, and fed themselves. Then they simply traded with each other what they had left over. Folks, we call that free trade. That worked. Never had a starving day after that. They tripled their production. See, even people who are Christians need to be checked on. We're all sinners. We all push the limit. So we need to be checked on. But what we really need to do is to love God, love your neighbor, and love yourself. That's what we need to do. See, now, here's the issue with the with the young men at the plantation. I'm an old man, and I'm crippled. Now, if there was a young man at the plantation and the governor went up to him and said, hey, young man, you go help that old guy and you give him your stuff because he can't fend for himself. I don't care who you are, you'd resent that. You do not want to be told what to do with your stuff. On the other hand, if we left him alone to produce the best he could on his land, and he did well, I would be willing to bet he would help that old man voluntarily because he's not being told what to do with his stuff. So what we need to do is we do need to check on each other because we are all human, but we need to love one another. We need to be there for one another. See, land ownership is a really big deal in Plymouth. And look, I sit on a river right here in Plymouth. And back then, we had a tribe of Indians in Plymouth called the Wampanoag Indians, and their chief Massasoit. But we did have another tribe here in Plymouth called the Pawtuxet Indians. Pawtuxet means small river. They were named after our river. Now, before the Pilgrims came here, hunters would come from Europe, hunt and go back home. On occasion, they would invite Indians aboard their ships to trade with them, capture them as slaves, and take them back to Europe. One of those Indians' name was Squanto. Squanto was a Pawtuxet Indian. Now, he was invited aboard a ship by a hunter by the name of Hunt. Well, Hunt took him back to Europe. He escapes to a monastery, learns English. 6 months later, he comes back on another ship to discover the Pawtuxet Indians, his tribe, wiped out by a plague. He went into mourning with Massasoit and the Wampanoag. 6 months later, the Pilgrims arrived. He became the interpreter between the Pilgrims and the Indians. That is the only way they could communicate. Governor William Bradford did refer to him as a special gift from God. But why do I bring this up? Because when people come to see me, they assume the Pilgrims stole the land from the Indians. They did not. The Indians did not want the land. They would not come back on it because of the plague. So the Pilgrims took land nobody wanted. Everything after that they paid for to the chief Massasoit. Guys, this is very important. If we can't own property, we have absolutely no power. Whoever owns the property we do business on will be our master. We will be their slave. We have to have the ability to own property. And the number one property the Pilgrims believed they owned and nobody had a right to touch was their conscience, what they believed. Folks, what you believe is your property. Nobody has a right to take it from you. And that's why the Pilgrims came to Plymouth. There was a gentleman back in England trying to take the property of what they believed away from them. They would not allow it. They came here instead. And of course, that gentleman's name is King James. And when you come to Plymouth, you have to understand how things were done differently under biblical law. See, we signed the Scrooby Covenant, came to Plymouth, and in Plymouth, we wrote a law called the Mayflower Compact. Now, the Mayflower Compact was another covenant, a civil covenant, where we would form a government, a civil body politic, with Jesus, God, in charge, with biblical law. So the covenant is an umbrella that brings everything the Pilgrims did together because their textbook and everything they did was the Bible. So if you look at the Bible and you get principles to raise your family, to build a political system, to build an economy, it all comes out of the Bible. And when you follow that and you stay under the covenant, you're going to be great. See, God is a God of order. And when you put God's principles in place, you're going to see order. Now, if you take God out of the picture, he no longer is king. He no longer is on his throne. You're going to have disorder because you just remove God from the picture. And I think lately today, if you notice what's going on, we have a little disorder going on. That is because today we're moving away from the covenant with God and we're not putting God on his throne. Now, what this means, if you're going to remove God from his throne, if you're going to take him out, something's going to fill that void. It's going to be there. And what's going to fill that void? Well, back in the 1600s in England, King James filled the void. King James felt he was God's representative on earth as the king. Well, if you're going to think you're God's representative on earth, eventually you're going to think you're God on earth. and he had everybody have to go to his church and worship him. But the Pilgrims wouldn't do it. They wanted to worship Jesus Christ, and they separated and started their own church. Now look what's going on today. If you want God gone, he's got to be completely gone. To fill that void. And who you fill that void with? The state. And today the state is trying to become God. The state wants us to worship it. Look what's happening. Let's take a hypothetical. Let's say for the past couple years we had a pandemic. And during that pandemic, the state was telling us what we could do. For example, they told you could go to Walmart, you could go to Home Depot, you could go to the package store, but you couldn't go to church. You see, they were moving church from the picture and removing God from the picture. And once you totally eliminate God and the church, now the state takes over, and the state tells you what you can do and what you cannot do, and you've just lost your liberties and you've just lost your freedom. You are not going to be free or have any liberties without God being in charge, without biblical law. Because I'll tell you what, if it's not biblical law, where's the law going to come from? It's going to come from people. Here's an example. You want me to be king? Happy to do it. I'll take the job. And you know what I'm going to do today? I'm going to set the law. You know what I'm going to do next week? Change it in my favor. But I can't change God's law. Without that truth, without that constant, you cannot have a civil government. And that takes commitment. Commitment to the covenant. If you were to come visit me here in Plymouth, I'd take you to a statue downtown called the Pilgrim Mother. The statue representing the 18 married women that came on the Mayflower. See, when we originally left Europe, we had two ships. One called the Speedwell, one called the Mayflower. We owned the Speedwell, we leased the Mayflower. The Speedwell picked our friends up in Holland, brought them to England, met the Mayflower, and came over. When they left England, the Speedwell leaked twice. They had to sell it for half what they paid for it, lost their investment. 20 of the original passengers had to stay behind, and they left late. When they landed on the tip of Cape Cod, they had run out of food. The men looked around the Cape, found a stash of corn buried in the ground by the Indians, and they took it. They did not steal the corn, they borrowed it, they paid it back later. Had they not taken the corn, they never would have survived, because you see, by the end of that first winter, they were doling out a quarter pound of cornbread per person per day to survive on. So as you can well imagine, the mothers took their bread and fed their children. They covered their children with their own bodies to keep them warm. Of those 18 married women, 14 died the first winter, sacrificing for the next generation, knowing if they did not survive, we would not survive. And written on the back of that statue, it says, they brought their families in a sturdy virtue and a living faith in God, without which nations perish. And while the women were making that tough decision, the men were making another one: hold back some of that corn. If they had no seed for the first season, nobody would have survived. They called that the starving time. And I'll be honest, when I tell that story, an awful lot of people ask me some difficult questions. One of those questions is, why in the world would these people do what they did? What would cause the Pilgrims to do this? Another question is, how do you pick 20 people to stay behind when your boat leaks? They didn't have to. 20 volunteered. You see, those first two starts were very rough. 20 had no problem staying behind. One of them was not William Bradford. When that event took place, William Bradford said this: like Gideon's army, the Lord thought us too many for the task at hand and cut our number down. And he got on the boat. In other words, he was saying, if you're not committed, stay home. And at the end of that first season, when Captain Jones got the Mayflower ready to go back to England, he turned to the 51 remaining Pilgrims and he said to them, I want you back on my ship. I'm taking you home. I cannot leave you here. Not one got back on. But I will tell you this. When that boat disappeared over the horizon, those 51 remaining Pilgrims fell on their knees and they wept. The last bit of civilization as they knew it just disappeared. So again, the question is this: why did they do it? Folks, they did it for you. They did it for me. They did it for posterity. They did it to pass that biblical law to the next generation. And now that's what we need to do. And that's why I'm so happy with homeschooling. If our country's going to be saved, the homeschooling movement is going to save it. We need to pass to the next generation what they need to know. Look, I told you folks, we signed a peace treaty with the Indians. We signed that peace treaty with a gentleman called Massasoit, the chief of the Wampanoag. Back in the 1600s, the Wampanoag lived right here in Plymouth and on Cape Cod and in New Bedford and in Rhode Island. He was chief of all of them, very important man, but he was also our friend. Without him signing that peace treaty, the Pilgrims would not have survived. But also keep this in mind, 3 years into that peace treaty, Massasoit was at his camp in Rhode Island. The man had the plague. He was dying. A gentleman from Plymouth by the name of Edward Winslow, once governor, put some herbs together, and Ed Winslow walked to Rhode Island to nurse Massasoit back to health. Winslow walked 40 miles. Halfway there, he was met on a path by an Indian who told him not to bother finishing the trip. Massasoit died. Well, he finished the trip anyway, and he discovered Massasoit had not yet died. He was very close, and Ed Winslow nursed him back to health. From that day forward, they were great friends, and that peace treaty was even stronger. Now we'll move ahead 50 years. 50 years later, we had the King Philip War. King Philip was not a European. He was Massasoit's son. His Christian name was Philip. He went to negotiate not to go to war with the then governor of Plymouth, Josiah Winslow, Edward Winslow's son. While they're negotiating, Philip said to Winslow, he says, "Hey, I'm a chief. You're just a governor. I'm not going to talk to you. I'll only talk to kings." They broke off the negotiations and went to war. From that day forward, Philip was referred to as King Philip because he would only talk to kings, and the two men who became great friends, their two sons went to war a generation later. That biblical education skipped that generation, and what was the result? The largest percentage of population was killed in the King Philip War than any war in our country's history, and it could have been stopped. That's how important education is. That's how important us passing to the next generation biblical law, and the reason our country was founded on biblical law as a Christian nation. I want to thank you for what you're doing, and I look forward to you passing to the next generation what we need to know. Thank you, and God bless you.